All right, thanks for joining us today. This is Eric Zimmerman with the National Association of Regional Councils. Pleased to have folks joining us today to talk about the Senate EPW, Environment and Public Works Committee Transportation Reauthorization Proposal called America's Transportation Infrastructure Act of 2019. They still have some work to do on that title. It'll get a lot snappier before we get to a final bill, I'm sure. But there we have it. So the ATIA or ATIA bill is a 5-year bill. It has $287 billion in contract authority, most of which is distributed by formula, and that will cover 5 years from fiscal years 2021 to 2025. There is obviously quite a lot in this bill. I'm going to run through some of the pieces that are, I suppose, most relevant to folks that I suspect are on the call today, what I really want to do is leave some time at the end for some Q&A. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to at least peruse the bill or some of the analyses that are out there, including our own. We do have a section by section that goes into probably more detail than I'll be able to get into today. But there are quite a few elements in this bill that are relevant to MPOs and regional planning. So let's dive in and I'll present some of those to you. And feel free to use the chat pod within GoToMeeting if you have any questions along the way. I'll probably get to those at the end. You can also always get in touch with me at eric@narc.org as well. So as I mentioned, the bill contains about $287 billion in funding over 5 years. The reminder here is that this is only the highway portion of the bill. In the Senate, the jurisdiction for the bill is divided, and so we still have other pieces yet to come. It's expected that at this level of funding of the complete 5-year bill would be somewhere in the $500 billion range over 5 years. From the most general sense, there's really not major changes to the structure or function of the program in an effort to craft a bill that would be able to get through fairly easily and quickly. The Senate really stuck to the structure of the bill structure of the program as it has been for the last couple of reauthorizations, actually, with some notable changes in MAP 21 in terms of consolidation, but the function of the program really has stayed the same, and that's no different here. There are some notable additions. In particular, there is a climate title to this bill, which is a first. There's also quite a bit in here for resilience, and then some other elements that are more important for the chairman, including wildlife crossings, and some other elements that make the bill a little more focused on some rural concerns that have made it in here, as well as, I suppose, as sort of a balance to some of the other items that also got in. So a bill where I think both sides probably saw their primary objectives met. Maybe both sides were a little happy and a little unhappy, and that's generally the way legislation works best in this town. And then there's also, I think, a notable addition of quite a number of new programs and pilot projects, and I'm going to go into some of those in fairly rapid detail because there are so many of them. But that's in contrast really to the major shift we saw, as I mentioned, in MAP 21, where we saw a consolidation of some 100+ programs back down into the core set of programs, core set of 5 or 6 programs that the bill was reduced to then, and that was largely maintained with the addition of a freight program in the FAST Act. We really saw they generally stuck with that consolidation effort and did not create a bunch of new programs. This bill would certainly reverse that to some extent, and does create a number of new programs to deal with a fairly wide range of issues, including climate, resilience, but some other things that we'll get into as well. So just to run through some of the most relevant portions of the bill. First, obviously, what folks are interested in is some of the planning regulations and the way that the bill deals with planning. So this bill does contain what I call clarifications and allowances regarding, for example, when MPOs are first designating officials. So I read that to mean when they're first formed and are first created, they need to consider the equitable and proportional representation of the population of the metropolitan planning area in designating their policy board. Also clarifies language regarding when there's the designation of more than one MPO in an urbanized area. This gets back to a little bit of the consideration from the MPO rule, but really is more of a clarification of some of the elements that were raised during that process, certainly not a return anywhere close to the MPO rule at all. And then also makes specific allowance for the use of social media as a public outreach tool. The bill as it currently reads applies it only to states, but I was told that was a drafting error, that they will clarify that, and it's meant to apply to MPOs as well. And then, there's also a provision in this bill that I think is of particular note, and when it comes to the planning section, and that is on fiscal constraint in long-range transportation plans. And what this EPW bill does is it requires USDOT within 1 year of passage of legislation to update the CFR to basically ensure that the out years of a long-range transportation plan is considered anything after 4 years. So this bill, though I think there was some confusion about this to begin, does not eliminate fiscal constraint, but it does change the nature of fiscal constraint such that the most restrictive fiscal constraint requirements are on the first 4 years of your plan, and then in the out years, which would then be years 5 and beyond, it's a less stringent application of fiscal constraint. So this is an important change. This is one that I certainly would love to have folks take a specific look at, and I would like some feedback on what folks think about this provision in particular. So this is one that I'll certainly be reaching out to have some follow-up conversations about. But those are the most relevant changes in terms of planning regulations and requirements. Really, it leaves as I mentioned, just like with everything else, it basically leaves the planning process largely alone, save for a couple of items as mentioned. Next up is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. I'm sure folks are well aware, one of our big asks, or our biggest ask is a continued increase in the level of suballocation of this program for local project decisions. Though we have some indication that during the process, there was an expectation that they would increase suballocation, in the end, as it turned out, they left it at 55%. And so that's something that obviously we'll be working strongly in the House to move that number up so that we have some ground when we get to final negotiations to try and increase the suballocated portion of this program. Also makes a few changes to the eligibility under STBG, including construction of wildlife crossing structures and a few other items. Integrates the idea of natural infrastructure as an allowable use for STBG funds, and a couple of others as well. And then under STBG, as TAP now is, obviously the STBG set aside technically, though still is really the TAP program. The TAP program saw some significant changes that are notable and worthwhile talking about. First, it substantially increases the funding for TAP. In the last fiscal year of the FAST Act, the funding for TAP is $850 million. Under the Senate EPW bill, that increases to $1.2 billion in the first year of its bill. So that's a significant increase. In addition, it increases the suballocated portion of TAP from 50% currently to 57.5%. And I'll note that the 57.5 was originally where the STBG suballocated portion overall was going to move to until they moved it back down to 55%. There's also a number of other changes to TAP that are I think, extremely important. In addition to the additional funding, there's also obligation authority that comes along with the contract authority under this program. That's going to provide a lot of opportunity and incentive for states not to park funds under this program as they have in the past, but it, I think, increases the likelihood that more dollars get out through this program. In addition, the Senate bill would clarify what we've been told it was a clerical error in the past, that basically made MPOs in urbanized areas under 200,000, essentially left them out of the TAP program, and this would explicitly make them eligible to compete for TAP funding. TAP, of course, all TAP funding has to go out through a competitive process, and so it would allow MPOs over 200,000 to continue to run the competitive process for their urbanized area, and would allow MPOs for population under 200,000 to compete for the funds as distributed by the state and through their competitive process. So I think taken all together, these are really significant and important changes that folks within the local government community and certainly within the bike ped community have been working for quite a long time. Obligation authority in particular is one that I think is recognized as a major change and a positive change. So the changes to the TAP program overall, I think, are seen as pretty substantial. Metropolitan planning funding, I have noted in some other materials, does increase in the bill, but not at any significant amount. I think it's about a 7% increase in the first year, and would be about $2 billion over the 5 years of the bill. One notable area that I know folks are interested in, there's no change to the formula as to how those funds are distributed, which means essentially it still harkens back to the funding as it was allocated in 2009, which means really the bill is using census data from 2000 in order to distribute the PL funds under the program. So probably something that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and something that was not changed in this bill. Under the CMAQ program, another area where there were some changes. One, I think maybe the most notable is that CMAQ funds would be able to be used for operating assistance for public transportation projects. So that is something that I think folks would find interesting and notable, and then makes a few other minor changes, but I think that's really the key change that I saw under the CMAQ program. Under freight, there are some new eligibilities added, though most of that is under the portion that is controlled at the state level. But one significant change in this area is that it does require that MPOs be included on state freight advisory committees. It changes the lineup of entities that must be represented on those committees, and specifically spells out that MPOs are part of the required elements of those committees. So that's, I think, a positive step in areas, especially if MPOs are being left off currently. Under the HSIP, the safety title, one major change that I saw here was to the ability to use funds. Up to 25% of funds under HSIP would be able to be used for sort of non-project and behavioral type efforts, such as research, public awareness campaigns, and the like. So that's a change that was made there. And then there's some other safety elements that we'll get into when we talk about some of the new programs. In fact, that is the next slide. So now let's talk about some of the new programs that the bill contains. And I'm going to start out talking about two new programs that the bill creates. And I'm going to talk about them together because the bill takes sort of similar approaches, even though they are programs tackling two different issue areas. And so this is one program is the safety incentive program. Really, it's a couple different programs but it's basically safety incentive programs and then carbon reduction programs. And they are similar in the sense that both have a formula component that would be distributed based on a formula relative to the state's overall percentage of the core programs of the bill. They would get that same percentage of the funding available under these programs. But they also have carved out a discretionary element as well. And so some of the funding would go out by formula, so every state would get a share, and then a portion would go out by discretionary grants, applications to the Secretary of Transportation, who would be making the decisions about who would receive funding. In addition, both require a certain level of suballocation of the formula dollars, and in fact, that suballocation level is higher than STBG or even TAP. The TAP suballocation, it requires that 60% be suballocated by population, though it only has two strata. It's MPOs 200,000 and larger, and then other areas of the state. So, but it does require that 60% of the funds be distributed in that manner based on the percentage of the state that is in urbanized areas over 200,000. In addition, both have incentives within the program that incentivize the creation of a specific report, and I'll get a little bit into the details, though I'm not going to go too deep into them. But and based on the creation of the mandated or the report as outlined, in cases where the state chooses to prepare that report, then a portion of the funding that's coming can be flexed to be used as surface transportation block grant funding. So it basically could be used for any project eligible under STBG, in addition to any project eligible under the base program, either the safety incentive or the carbon reduction program. So the reason I'm spending a little bit of time with this is that I think this is a fairly unique structure. I'm sure others could point out if this has been utilized before. Usually there's not too many new ideas, so it's entirely possible that this has been used before. But from what I have seen, certainly there is nothing in existing law like this. There could have been some proposals in the past, I suppose. So to go into a little bit more detail, so on the safety incentive program, essentially, it's to reduce fatalities and serious injuries, particularly and especially among vulnerable road users. And that comes into play in urbanized areas and in states that have higher than average rates of serious injuries and fatalities to a defined class of vulnerable road users, which is pretty much non-motorists writ large. And so the way that this program breaks down, the formula program, is that half of the money that is distributed to the state or the MPO, if it's suballocated, can be spent on any safety project unless they are a vulnerable road user safety focus area, which is spelled out 1.5 serious injuries or fatalities per 100,000 individuals. Or there's a couple of other criteria as well that qualify them as one of these focus areas. If you are in a focus area, then your funds must be spent on projects to benefit vulnerable road users. So that's the first 50% of the funding. The second 50% of the funding can be used for any of those projects as outlined above for the safety projects, unless a state has chosen to prepare a vulnerable road user safety assessment or has recently updated a previously developed assessment. And under those circumstances, that essentially allows you then to use the second 50% of funding under the formula portion of this program on projects that are STBG eligible. So I hope that's not too confusing. It takes a little while to work out, and it took me a little while to work it out in my head, certainly. And I'm sorry, the suballocation is actually 65% now as I'm looking at my notes. That is the way that this works. So essentially it incentivizes the creation of this vulnerable road users report or assessment. My one problem I have with this, and something I need to clarify with committee staff and see what the thinking was, is that I feel this leaves this, and it does the same thing under the carbon reduction program. It leaves MPOs essentially beholden to their state. The state gets to decide whether or not to do the assessment as outlined. And so I think if the state doesn't do the assessment, there's no provision by which the MPO by itself can do a similar assessment and therefore be able to flex those dollars and use them as STBG funds. So I do want to clarify that. I think that would be kind of a weakness if the MPOs were left basically, to the discretion of the state whether or not to do this assessment. So I will learn more about that and then get back. In addition, under the same program, these safety incentive programs, there is also a fatality reduction performance program. And so this is the discretionary side of the program. And so basically this rewards states and units of local government served by an MPO that demonstrate reductions in fatalities and serious injuries, or a more rapid decrease in the rate of those than in previous years. So basically, in areas that have either reduced or slowed the growth of serious injuries and fatalities, there would be funds given in the amount of $5 to $30 million, and the federal share on those dollars would be 100%. So again, creates a pretty significant incentive for trying to get some of those dollars. However, there's only $100 million each year. So if you're talking 5 to 30, you're talking, you know, somewhere between 3 and 20 awards would be granted under this program. So similarly, there's also the carbon reduction incentive programs. It works much the same way. Basically, it allows 50% of the funds available under the program can be used on most categories of projects under CMAQ, in addition to a whole slew of other projects. So that's the first 50% of the funding that you would receive under the carbon reduction incentive programs through the formula portion of the program. And then a state, in consultation with its MPOs, may develop a carbon reduction strategy. The creation of that carbon reduction strategy then makes you eligible to use the second 50% for STBG projects if you choose. And so again, the structure is quite a bit the same in terms of that sub-allocated portion, in terms of incentivizing the creation of this plan, and by doing so then allowing you to use funds as STBG funds. In addition, there's a carbon reduction performance program, also works very similarly. If you have seen that, if you demonstrate reductions in overall or per capita emissions or slower growth in the rates of emissions over a 2-year period, then you are similarly eligible for $5 to $30 million awards under this program, federal share at 100%, and also $100 million available for this per year from 2021 to 2025. So that was a lot of words to describe a couple of programs. I find them interesting, which is why I spent as much time on them as I did. Again, would love to hear feedback and thoughts, particularly on those programs, but I do think that they are fairly unique in their structure. So want to spend a little bit more time going through some of the other new programs, though I won't be able to spend a whole lot of time on any one, just because there are quite a few of them. One of the more notable new programs is this the Bridge Investment Program, which, as you can see, $3.265 billion from general funds over 5 years to incentivize the repair of bridges. MPOs with the population, MPOs in areas over 200,000 are actually eligible to receive grants under the program. And there are very specific details on how projects will be evaluated and chosen. I find this particularly interesting. Congress is obviously willing to continue to grant the administration the authority to choose projects in quite a number of cases, but in this case in particular, I saw more carefully spelled out, and I think than in the past, how the administration is to choose those projects. So it's Congress giving administration the authority to do it, but trying its best to put as many strictures and constraints on the way that those projects will be chosen, so as to maintain a modicum of control over that process. So that's actually notable here. I won't go into the details. There are way too many. You can certainly check out the language, and we can discuss further if folks are interested there. Some other new programs that are MPO related: wildlife crossing safety, MPOs and RTPOs, if they are designated, are eligible. This is for projects to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and improve habitat connectivity. There's an accessibility data pilot project. Sorry, gotta find my notes here. This is the Commute Act for folks that may have heard about this before. It's a new pilot program for basically to develop and cultivate an accessibility data set to make data available to MPOs and RTPOs to utilize accessibility as a measure within their planning process. There's also another pilot that I think is extremely interesting that is very MPO specific, but again, RTPOs are also eligible for this. This is a prioritization process pilot program, and it's essentially to support data-driven approaches to project selection, and has some basically requires the scoring of projects and utilizing that scoring for determining what projects are prioritized within your plan. Allows for awards up to $2 million to develop this, and there will be $10 million a year for 2021 to 2025. So that's I think a fairly interesting approach and program that folks would be interested in. Increasing safe and accessible transportation options. This is a particularly notable area. This is another area I would love to hear feedback, and folks have thoughts about this one. This requires that both states and MPOs use 2.5% in the case of states of their SPR, their state planning and research funding. In the case of MPOs, your PL funds, to carry out activities and planning, one or more activities to, quote, increase safe and accessible options for multiple travel modes for people of all ages and abilities, which may include development of complete streets standards, a complete streets prioritization plan, active transportation plan, regional or mega-regional planning, and transit-oriented development as well. So I'm going to be interested to have this discussion about whether most folks feel that they're already spending 2.5%, that this would not actually be a heavy burden, or whether folks think that this is ridiculous, that they're trying to parse out 2.5% of PL funds to be used for purposes designated by Congress. You know, taking into account that it also requires 2.5% of SPR funds, which is a pretty significant, a more significant chunk of money than 2.5% of PL funds for sure. So this will be an area of discussion, and I would love to hear some feedback on this particular provision. There's grants for charging and alternative fueling infrastructure, which is a new grant program. MPOs are eligible recipients under this program. And then finally, a congestion relief program. MPOs are eligible, but only it's only for areas of 1 million population or larger. States are eligible to obligate funds in urbanized areas under 1 million population, however. And this is to basically create discretionary grants to develop innovative and multimodal solutions to congestion relief, including things like HOV toll lanes, cordon pricing, a whole host of other items. So this is another one that I think is interesting and obviously MPO directed. Some more new programs. I told you there's a lot of them. So the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation, the PROTECT grant program. It is basically a program of grants for resilience improvements. It requires that 2% of the funds each year be set aside for planning purposes specifically. MPOs can then use those funds to develop a resilience improvement plan. And then further, MPOs are also eligible for other grants under the same program: resilience improvement grants, community resilience and evacuation route grants, and at-risk coastal infrastructure grants. So there are 3 other areas of grant making for specific project-related elements under this program as well. And in addition, interestingly, this program incentivizes not only the development of a resilience improvement plan, so areas that have developed an MPO or state that has developed a resilience improvement plan can increase the federal share of a project by 7%. And for states and MPOs that have integrated that resilience improvement plan into their long-range transportation plan, can increase the federal share by another 3%. So you can potentially increase the federal share under this program by 10% by doing both of those elements. So that's, I think, rather interesting. This is another one that has both formula component and a competitive program. So there's $786 million each year under the formula program, and then another $200 million for some of the competitive grants for the same period. So you can see sort of a pattern here with some of these programs trying to divide between, distributing by formula and distributing competitively. There's a disaster relief mobilization pilot program. This is specifically for local communities to develop disaster preparedness and disaster response plans that include the use of bicycles. So that is MPO eligible as well as RTPO eligible. There's community connectivity pilots. Basically, this creates funding available for planning and consideration of the removal of existing transportation facilities that create barriers to community activity. And then, in addition, has an element whereby after that planning is completed, if it's determined that a facility should be removed or rebuilt in a more context-sensitive manner, then there is also funding available to carry out the project of actually removing that facility. So another one with a planning element as well as a project element. There's a surface transportation system funding alternatives. This is a new pilot program which basically is to test the feasibility of things like a road usage fee. So basically federalizing some study, some additional study of some concepts that would eventually lead to an alternative form of funding for the transportation program. So that is some of the new programs that this bill contains. There's actually quite a number of others, most of which aren't MPO specific, or I would have talked about them, but that are really state specific. So as you can see, we just ran through, I don't know, maybe eight programs that are brand new, maybe more, maybe there's 10 that are MPO specific, another, maybe half dozen or so that are really kind of more state specific. So you can see this bill really does create quite a number of new projects, new programs and pilots relative to previous bills. So some other items that I'm sure folks are interested in. One is project streamlining. The focus in this bill, in this regard, really focuses on the one federal decision process that was established as basically a pilot program under the FAST Act. It makes some changes, notably making it sort of a permanent approach. And what one federal decision very briefly does is basically creates a better process for dealing. This is for larger projects. I forget the minimum, but it's quite a high, couple $100 million, I believe, and larger projects. Basically, your project, if you approach the government and ask for this this process to be initiated, the federal government has a dashboard. Part of that dashboard is an indication of where the permitting is on a project at any particular time, with a goal of speeding up the review by doing more concurrent review at the federal agency level, and having one agency designated as the decision maker for the project as it's moving through the process. Basically to cut down on the amount of headache and heartache that project sponsors go through trying to get the federal government to sign off or not on a project. And so basically what this bill, the EPW bill, does is it makes that it basically makes that a permanent entity, and make some other changes, but essentially one federal decision would be something that would be available and accessible to a broader number of projects, and so could help speed the process. I believe it's still for larger projects, will still remain to be for larger projects, but as it is right now, I know that they can't go out and solicit projects to come be part of their process, I think they would now be allowed to do that, for example, and some other changes to that process. There's a travel demand data and modeling study, which I thought was interesting. Basically would require a study within 2 years of the bill and then every 5 years thereafter, basically gathering travel data and travel demand forecasts from a representative sample of states and MPOs, and then compare forecasts with observed data and use the results to develop best practices or guidelines to use in forecasting travel demand in the future. So that's obviously very interesting and very relevant for MPOs in regional planning. There's also a required report on air quality improvements, basically requires a study of the CMAQ program and with some determination made for the effectiveness of projects conducted under CMAQ in terms of reducing the cost effectiveness, how well they've been invested in minority and low-income communities, et cetera. And so that would be by a comptroller general report would be required in that case. And then finally, as folks I'm sure are well aware, the FAST Act contained a $7.57 billion rescission of contract authority, one of the many budget gimmicks used to help pay for the FAST Act when it was passed. That rescission still looms. There is great interest among the committees of jurisdiction to attempt to remove that rescission. So the EPW committee included a provision within its bill that repeals that rescission as well. They've also introduced separate legislation in this regard and have stressed the vast importance of making sure that that gets done this year because it gets much trickier as we get out of this fiscal year. In addition, it makes the job of increasing the size of the transportation authorization that much harder if the rescission goes into effect because it changes some of the baseline numbers that underlie the assumptions that they make when they decide how much money to give to the program. So this is extremely important that it be resolved, and hopefully this is a first step in making sure that happens. But as folks are aware, there's going to be a very fast-moving month before the fiscal year ends. So it'll have to be attached to something that's must pass, and hopefully that can happen. So that was as quick a burn as I could do through a bill that's 500 plus pages. There are a lot of things I certainly left out, not intentionally necessarily, but because there's only so much that I can cover in an hour-long webinar. But a little bit about what's next. As mentioned, this is only the highway title. There are, because of the split jurisdiction, we still have to wait for action by the Banking and the Commerce Committees in the Senate to take action on things like public transportation, as well as rail and some safety provisions. And there's not yet indication as to when that is going to happen, so we will have to see how they decide to proceed. Obviously, T&I, Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House, will also be an active player, we expect, in this arena. Still remains to be seen what their appetite is for major change in a bill versus going along a little bit more with the status quo as the Senate bill did. There's been some indication that action on a House bill could come in early 2020. And so we'll have to see how that progresses. It's unclear yet there on the timing. And then, of course, the hardest jobs of all come down for the Senate Finance and the House Ways and Means Committees to come up with the funding necessary, which will be somewhere in the vicinity of $100 billion to cover the shortfall between expected gas tax revenues and desired funding levels under this bill. So that is no small amount of change. There have been some indications about using fees on electric vehicles and some other funding mechanisms along those lines, and so that's something we'll be tracking carefully and closely to see if that gains some leverage. It's something that I know that Chairman Barrasso from UPW has mentioned and discussed. So that may be an area where he's interested in pushing the debate, even though he's, the chair of the policy committee for this. It seems like he might want something to say about how the bill is funded. So that will be an interesting one. And then, of course, that runs us square into the 2020 elections as we get into the early part of next year, as we head toward the end of the current reauthorization, which, of course, comes on September 30th, 2020, just a mere 5 or so weeks, maybe 6 weeks before the presidential election occurs, which unfortunately forces me to whisper at least the dreaded E word, which is the possibility of extensions if something is not able to get done in probably the earliest part of next year. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of a timeline and what we're tracking on this. And so with that, I will throw it open. I don't know if any questions have come through. It does not appear that there are any. If you have any questions or anything, please type it into the chat pod. That is part of the GoToMeeting.
Eric, I actually have a few questions on my
end,
if I can read them out.
Thank you.
Yes, no problem. And before that, I just wanted to mention, this is Macy with NARC, and mention a few little housekeeping items. For those who want the PowerPoint presentation, you can find it in the handouts on the little right-hand side of your screen, the webinar panel, and then we should have a recording of the webinar up pretty soon after the webinar ends, but I'll be sure to send it out to you all in an email tomorrow. So with that, with the questions, referring to the planning clarifications and allowances section that you were talking about earlier, Eric, somebody asked what exactly the changes were on policy board composition and whether there was any kind of mandatory aspect of this.
Sure, thanks. Good question. Thank you for asking for a clarification of the clarifications. And that is to say, my reading of it, and I still need to follow up again with committee staff. There's a few things in here that I have questions about. The indication I get from reading this section is that the new requirement would apply only when you are first designating officials. So I would read that to mean either a newly formed MPO, perhaps an MPO that is redesignating. When they are first designating officials, then they must consider, quote, the equitable and proportional representation of the population of the metropolitan planning area, end quote. So this is certainly an area where there would be, the devil would come down to the details in terms of how DOT would choose to interpret this and then therefore put it into the planning requirements and regulations. But my reading of it at present, and I need to figure out what intent is here, is that it would apply to new and possibly redesignating MPOs.
Great. Next question. I think NARC has called for sub-allocation and HSIP. Do you consider the new safety initiative to be good enough?
It is not quite the same. It does work to localize some of the funds. So I think it's kind of a half loaf, maybe a little bit more than a half loaf. It is not the same as fully sub-allocating some of those HSIP funds. But it does do a good job of localizing some of those funds. Though I will say it would be interesting to see an analysis of the areas that would be affected by the requirement for spending the funds on vulnerable users. I suspect most urbanized areas probably would be considered an area where those funds would have to be spent on vulnerable users. That, again, might not be one of those strictures that in most places matters all that much, but I do think it would be more constrained funding under the way that this is currently structured, most likely than if you saw a sub-allocation of HSIP, which I think would be a little more free to spend on safety projects more generally. So.
Next question, any earmarks?
No. Quick and easy answer to that one.
Somebody asked where they can find the proposed bill, or are there any web links that you recommend?
Sure. Yes. So I have sent out some updates that have some of the links in there. So if you've received anything from me, if you've seen our section by section, there's actually a link at the very top of that document that takes you right to the most recent version of the bill. If you go to the Senate EPW site, they also have a page of things up there, because what you want to look for is the manager's amendment to the bill. They did introduce a manager's amendment at the markup. I don't think were enormous changes in that manager's mark, but the manager's mark is the most up-to-date information. So you can either find that in our documentation or on the EPW site.
Okay, next one. Are other core programs pegged to SAFETEA-LU, i.e. 2000 census figures?
So the only formula I believe that still is specifically pegged to the 2009 funding levels, which then of course is 2000 census data, is PL. They've made changes to the core programs, which is STBG, NHPP, and HSIP, such that those are now essentially distributed based on your share of distributed funds in previous years, which means it still pegs eventually back to a formula, but the formula itself is sort of gone at this point. And so the answer is kind of sort of. It sort of is still pegged to that older distribution by virtue of the fact that at some point these funds were distributed based on a formula that did peg back probably to safety LU levels of the 2009 levels. But that at this point, the formula that you'll see within the bill itself is one that is, again, based on how much funding you got previously. One other item, actually, I'll take this opportunity to point out one thing that I had forgotten to highlight earlier, and that is a requirement within this bill for guaranteed amounts, and basically says that each state's apportionment is equal to at least 95% of estimated tax payments paid into the trust fund, which is existing law, but also adds additional language further requiring that a state's apportionment must be at least 2% higher than the apportionment it received for FY 2020 and at least 1% greater than the apportionment received for the previous fiscal year. So in other words, state apportionment, the total apportionment that a state receives has to go up by at least 2% from 2020 and at least 1% from the year before. So that's actually an interesting guarantee, one that certainly will drive some of the numbers in the bill. And I'll also point out, and this is a little bit unrelated, but I did want to point out that there's because the core programs are now distributed, essentially there's a lump of money, and then the three core programs each get a set percentage of those funds. Congress has found a creative way to ensure that the NHPP program, which is, of course, mostly state-driven dollars, grows at a faster rate than STBG or HSIP. And it's kind of a bookkeeping exercise. They had some funding in their last time around in FAST Act to sort of balance things out a little bit between some of the programs, but this year used it more like a bludgeon and made it real money. And so that money is going to go to NHPP first, and then the rest of the dollars get distributed among the three core programs, including STBG, NHPP, and HSIP. So, I think that's something that we should keep an eye on as to how those funds are distributed. It basically means that the rate of growth in NHPP, I believe, is about twice what it is in STBG. So another area we want to make sure that we see equitable growth in the programs going forward as well. So.
Great. Lots of questions still coming through. Next one, when you talked about CMAQ and operations for public transit, did it extend 5-year eligibility for operations to no limit on years? Please clarify.
It did for certain, let's see, no time limit using these funds for operating assistance in non-urbanized areas and in urbanized areas with a population of 200,000 or fewer. So if you're a non-urbanized area or your urbanized area is 200,000 or less, then there's no time limit to the 5-year time limit not, it does not apply. Areas over 200,000, obviously the implication is that it still applies.
Great, thanks. Can you go over the best timing for MPOs to begin the process of engaging their congressional delegations, particularly those that might sit on the relevant committees?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously the EPW process, at least for the moment, is complete. So the next step at least for this portion of the bill that we're talking about here, is going to be when a bill goes to the floor, whenever that might be. And that'll be after, again, we see a Senate and a Commerce and a banking bill added. In the House, I think the time is now. You know, they are considering how to proceed, what they want to do, and so especially in the House, if you have members on the committee, now's a good time to let them know what your priorities are. They've submitted their priorities to the committee at this point, but the committee certainly has not written a bill / finalized the bill by any stretch. So there's still some time to try and influence that. So now, I would say in the House, certainly now is the time to do that.
Can you elaborate on operating assistance on CMAQ?
I cannot. I can read through it a little bit more and see what else I can pull out of that section. But it was fairly, from what I could tell, fairly straightforward in terms of what it stated. And so I'll take a look. So whoever asked that question, if you can just drop me an email, I'll take another look and see if there's more to that I can share.
What type of public awareness is HSIP funds available for?
That's all it said. It listed, if I remember correctly, and I can go back and take a look at the actual legislative text, but I believe it sort of spelled out examples of what the funding can be used for, and it's up to 25%. See, I'm sorry, trying to talk and look through my notes. Give me 1 second, see if I can find this. I'm not, for some reason I can't put my finger on it right now, but listed a number of eligible activities, including public outreach. And if I remember correctly, and this goes back a ways, I think funds used to be able to be used for things like that, more on the sort of behavioral side, but I think they took that eligibility away a couple of bills ago. And so I think this is adding, potentially, don't quote me, but potentially adding back in some eligibilities that had previously been allowed. But I think that's all it really said. I don't think there was much more detail. So again, I believe that'll be something that, if this were to become law, it's something that would have to be spelled out by DOT through guidance process.
Next question, do you think the House is likely to increase sub-allocations to MPOs generally?
Yes, I think there's a decent chance that we will get the House to increase sub-allocation, and really what that means, because if they came in at 55%, it'd be kind of over. Once there's agreement between the two chambers on something, it's not going to be negotiated in conference because both agreed. So it's really vital, actually, that we see an increase in the House to at least put us in a negotiating position to get an increase. And so I think the House will recognize that, certainly. I do think it's something that there's interest among not only the chairman, but other high-ranking folks on the committee. So I do think we'll be able to see them have an increase, and then see where that lands after we get through a markup process.
Okay, a few more questions. Can you expand on CMAQ for RTA operations?
Same answer. If anybody's interested in that, drop me an email and I will see if I can pull out some additional information on that specific provision. Seems like there's a lot of interest in that one. For the
fiscal constraint for the MTP, you mentioned the fiscal constraint mainly applies to the first 4 years. Does this mean anything beyond the 4-year horizon in the MTP do not have to meet the fiscal constraint requirement?
So my understanding, and this is not an area that I'm going to be able to talk with an enormous amount of specificity about. My understanding is that as it currently stands, basically after 10 years, there is a lesser burden for fiscal constraint. You can use sort of bands of the way that projects would be funded. It doesn't have to be laid out quite so specifically. Basically, what this would do is that this would apply that process starting at year 5 instead of at year 11. So it would require the same process that you go through now through 10 years through 4 instead. And then after that, there would still be fiscal constraint requirements. They would just be reduced. They would be minimized or lesser requirements than are currently required through the 10-year point. So obviously an area we're extremely interested in. I've had a little bit of conversation with committee staff about this, but I want to definitely have some more to get some clarification. So this is an area I will certainly do my best to provide some additional clarification from committee staff on.
So overall distributions are really still pegged to the 2020 census, even though everyone is getting more?
I'm not sure what it's really, well, some of the dollars essentially are pegged to the 2000 census, especially through metropolitan planning. So the overall size of the program grows, but the way that the funding is distributed, that pot of money is distributed among the states, and in this case among the MPOs, is essentially tied to some formulas and some distributions that go back quite a bit further. So it's not the size of the program that is impacted by the way that the funds are distributed, it's how much each state gets of that total larger pot of money. And that's where some of the concerns come in, especially because there's obviously been changes in population in some areas and less in others. And so, it does cause concern for some folks that we're still tying some of our distribution back to older census figures.
A couple more questions. Any sense if there's support for this proposal, or do we need to wait and see?
For this proposal being the EPW bill?
It doesn't clarify, no.
I mean, I think overall it's an interesting bill. I think if I were going to describe it very simply, I would say based on the political makeup of each chamber, the Senate set a fairly high floor for it. I think overall this is a bill we can be quite pleased about. I think it sets us up well. We can expect more from the House because the House cares more about how funds get down to the local level than the Senate does. And so the fact that the Senate did set a fairly good floor for us, I think is encouraging. We just need the House to set a good ceiling and then work within that to ensure that that we're happy with the final product. But I think overall this is a good bill. It's not perfect, no bill is, but I think for that reason alone, in some ways, it's a bill that I think has that we're supportive of, and I think is a good start to this process.
Okay, last question we have. So the PL fund increases will actually not be much more than a restoration of the funds rescinded?
I don't know how much. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. Hopefully, I mean, the key is to A, kill the rescission, B, try and bump up the increase to PL. So hopefully we can accomplish both of those, and then we'll see a more dramatic increase. But as currently written, that might be one way that you can look at it, because I do think PL funds are eligible for rescission. So, let's make sure we don't get to that endpoint. So if folks, somebody asked earlier about when to engage members on the bill or bills themselves, the rescission is another area that is probably worth reaching out to members of Congress about and letting them know, the negative impact that would have on you and your state and your region and how projects are going to get done. And, that let them know that this is going to be more pain than it's worth, and that they just need to find a way to get rid of this rescission. So.
Okay. So those were all the questions that we had, Eric.
Great. Well, I really appreciate everybody getting on today. We're a couple of minutes over. Sorry about that, but thanks so much for being with us. And this is the beginning of the process. Certainly nowhere near the end yet, and so lots more to come. And feel free to reach out at any time if you have any questions or if if you have any thoughts about any of the provisions that I raised. And thank you to Macy for helping me out with this webinar today. Bye all.